In this video, I'm going to just spend a few moments talking about Davis's article, The Harm That Has No Name. Davis tries to get us to understand that in terms of catcalls and wolf whistles, that we don't see them as serious in our society because we haven't identified or taken the time to identify the harm that it is that excuse me, that catcalls and wolf whistles causes women. She says once we start to identify the harm that occurs and put a name to this harm, we start to see how something that just has been put off largely, that this is just the way guys are, this is just boys being boys. It's a way of masking the problems involved in catcalls and wolf whistles. She identifies three specific harms that occur with catcalls and wolf whistles. The first is street harassment. She says street harassment are the verbal and nonverbal markers that men do towards women in the public spaces. She says that the sexual content of street harassment reminds women of their vulnerability to violent attack. It is, in a sense, a precursor to rape, or it has been a precursor to rape in some cases. And in an escalator, the fear of rape entraps a woman in a sexually terroristic environment. What she's trying to get us to understand right here is that catcalls and wolf whistles are set up in such a way that no matter what the woman does, no matter what her reaction is, whether she smiles and sees it as a compliment, whether she tries to ignore it, or whether she resists, verbally or physically resists these comments, women have been attacked. So what I've often noticed in my class in this kind of precursor in a sexually terroristic environment is that I address it in this way. Let's say a woman's walking down the street and some guys in a car drive by and they yell at her. I've had some women sit there and say it bothers them, some it disgusts them. Some have said that they ignore it, it's not a big deal, and some said that they've had a moment of fear. And then I ask, okay, you're walking down the street, car drives by, says something, and the car slows down. Then I start to get a greater response of fear. The car drives by, slows down, and then stops. At this moment, we can start seeing that sexually terroristic environment really start to occur. For most of the women in my class start to have mentioned that how it is when they slow down, when they stop, it's when they start feeling fear. And let's say the car drives by, slows down, stops, and then starts to back up. Well, at this moment, fear seems to be the main feeling that many women have. At least the women in my class have talked about that. So we see how this kind of innocent type of reaction by men, or the simple type of action by men, depending on the context and the extent of the action, does create this sexually terroristic environment. She feels street harassment generalizes the street by distributing power in such a way that supports male domination and female subordination. Now, it is this distribution of power that I think is important. While Davis's article focuses on this as a type of control over women, I think it's important when we take a look at this thing that this is more than just an act that's meant to control women. But it's also an act that reaffirms males' control over the public spaces. Let me say that again. That this genderized in the street, the distribution of power and genderized in the street, is set up in such a way as to reaffirm male dominance in the public spaces. A dominance that we often don't see and that we're often not aware of. The idea that men are socialized in our society to feel that the public space is theirs, that they are able to take up public space, they are able to control public space in certain ways. Now, the way I generally can show this in class is that at this moment I ask the students to stop and not move a muscle, and to take a look how each one of them are sitting. And the next time you're in a group of people or you're in a classroom, do the same. And what we generally see are men being laid back, their legs spread apart, their arms open. Women, much closer, much more confined. So the idea, and this gets back to the idea of hegemony, even in the way we sit, men often show or somehow affirm their dominance in the public space. We sit back, we spread our legs, we take open space. Women, to sit like women, it's about taking up as little space as possible. So we see in just something in the way students sit in class, we see that the way men feel that they just unconsciously feel that they just have the right to take up more of the public space. These types of catcalls and wolf whistles, I believe, are involved in the same process, that it reaffirms men's dominance of the public spaces. And it also does something interesting, I think, in placing women and how women react, is that women are placed into a submissive, aggressive position. They must be submissive in attracting the male gaze and the male attention. So they must stress and something. They must adhere to certain ideologies in the way they dress, in the way they act, in the way they talk, to attract male attention. While at the same time, they must be aggressive in maintaining their honor as women. So on one hand, they must be submissive and adhering to the ideologies of what a woman needs to do to attract male attention. But in attracting that attention, in that submissive consent to the ideologies of what it means to attract male attention, she must also be aggressive in this idea in protecting her honor, to protecting who she is. So we see, and again, no matter what she does in these kind of this sexually terroristic environment, no matter how she acts, she's open to attack. So we get back to Fry's double bind, that when a man does a catcall to a woman or a wolf whistle to a woman, it's an attempt to control her as a person. It is an attempt to reaffirm male dominance in the public spaces. And it sets women up in a double bind that no matter what choice they make and what reaction they make, they are open to attack. So finally, with this idea of street harassment, she says that it remains an invisible harm because it's seen as something other than harassment. It's really seen as just guys being guys. In fact, some guys take on or take pride in being able to do this. It's a way of exerting our masculinity. It's a way of proving to the other guys around us that we are men, right? And she also wants to make it very clear that men don't suffer from these actions in the way women have suffered. So we often don't recognize the suffering. This is one of the issues of male privilege. It's that we see and study after study that those people in these dominant privileged positions often don't see how power affects those people in less dominant or in subordinate positions. So because men don't suffer the harm, this is not street harassment. In fact, most men are able to take it as a compliment because we don't have the historical legacy, the violence that's put upon us by women, the way women have the historical legacy, the violence by men. So since we don't suffer it, we don't recognize it. Now, in this idea of street harassment, she brings up a few ideas that I think are important, that the consequences suffered by women. She says, because it's trivialized in our society, women often don't talk about it. And I see this is true in my classes. When I ask if women talk about this, I find out most women don't talk about catcalls and wolf whistles. This leads to the idea that a woman may doubt that she's being affected by street harassment. And if she does recognize that she is being affected by street harassment, she does acknowledge that idea, it often causes the woman to transform the pain into something else, something like flattery or some type of unconscious pleasure. So it would say that those women who enjoy or take it as a compliment when men yell at them is because the idea, the harm, the street harassment that occurs in that moment has been trivialized to such a point that women don't recognize it as street harassment. They recognize it as something like flattery or take some kind of unconscious pleasure by it. So this is her idea of street harassment, and street harassment is the first harm. But Davis goes a little bit further. She says, if it is this idea of sexual terrorism or creating this idea of fear, if there's fear of rape or fear of attack or fear of being bothered, doesn't have to be anything physical, just being bothered by men. If this fear exists, then it's more than simply harassment. It's sexual terrorism. And she defines sexual terrorism as men's systemic control and domination of women through actual or implied violence. Let me say that again. Sexual terrorism is men's systemic control and domination of women through actual or implied violence. That this violence is a continuum of behavior, like I say, the idea of slowing down, stopping, or backing up. Each one of those actions that occur along with the wolf whistle causes a different type of reaction within the woman. So it is this type of systemic control and domination of women through actual and implied violence that she says is happening with these wolf calls and wolf whistles and cat calls. The next harm that she talks about is spirit murder. And spirit murder is what happens when there's a disregard for others whose lives qualitatively depend on our regard. And what she's trying to get us to understand, that spirit murder she defines as a phenomenon that creates and perpetrates social structures that are defined by hate and fear and give unexpressed feelings an outlet. Next, she says, spirit murder is the cumulative effect of thousands of incidents meant to oppress women. So she has three parts of her definition. It's a total disregard for people's lives who qualitatively depend on our regard. It's a phenomenon that creates and perpetrates social structures that are defined by hate and fear. And it's this cumulative effect of the thousands of incidents meant to oppress women, that in this cumulative effect, it robs and murders just a little bit of that woman's spirit. So again, the three harms: street harassment, sexual terrorism, and spirit murder. She also wants us to understand that when we relate then the issues of street harassment, sexual terrorism, and spirit murder, and relate it to the issues of race, then we see that she argues that the dynamics change. That while all women suffer from these types of attacks that men engage in, she is arguing that it's different for black women than it is for white women, for two primary reasons. Is that it forces black women to see how that the slave consciousness still exists in society. That street harassment is a form that allows white men to maintain the boundaries set during slavery. Now we have to remember that historically what we've seen in our society is that white men have had greater access to women of color's bodies. The men of color have had access to white women's bodies. So it is in that type of historical connection, that historical legacy to white men's availability, or women of color's bodies' availability to white men. It's when she sits there and talks about this idea of maintaining this kind of slave master relationship. She says it's different for white women because white women are seen and positioned in this cult of true womanhood that is piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity that she talks about. So, and that white women are brought up to feel more protected, that they're the ones who've been placed on this pedestal of womanhood, this cult of true womanhood, as the epitome of motherhood, of womanhood, of femininity, and all these aspects that we use generally associate with being a woman. Where the black woman is the antithesis. She's the welfare mom. She's the Jezebel. She's sexually aggressive. She is not domestic. She is not pure. So we see how these dynamics, and this is her argument right here that sets it up, that because of race, street harassment, sexual terrorism, and spirit murder affect women of color differently than it affects white women. So just to summarize, there are 3 key harms that occur with the idea of wolf whistles and catcalls. The first is street harassment. The second one is sexual terrorism. And the third one is spirit murder. That this is more than just simply controlling women or an act to control women, but it's an act that reaffirms male dominance in the public space. And finally, that it's different for women of color, and Davis argues black women, than it is for white women, largely because of the historical availability to the female body. And that we see historically that white males have had greater access to women of color's bodies than men of color have had access to white female bodies. So it is in these dynamics, this historical legacy to the master-servant consciousness, that she argues is different, or creates complexities in the simple act of wolf whistles and catcalls. Thank you.